Hi, everybody. My name's Brad Kelly, and I'm the regional coordinator for the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Coast region. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this installment of this year's SBL Pacific Coast Regional Meeting that we're calling K-Ray and Katib, Read and Written. Obviously, things are a little different this year with the pandemic, and so some of the papers are coming to you as recorded videos. And I'm excited about this paper. We have a paper today by Dr. Diana Edelman, formerly of the University of Oslo. And this is a paper that comes from our program unit entitled The Bible and the Ancient Near East at the regional meeting. And so the format is the paper will be for about 20 minutes. And then the chair of that program unit, Dr. Tammy Schneider, will come on and interact a little bit with the presenter to kind of wrap things up for us. So without further delay, let me turn it on over to Diana Edelman and say that the title of her paper is Closing the Coffin on the Proposed Use of Esarhaddon's Vassal Ade to Compose Deuteronomy 13 and 25. So, Diana, if you would, please.
Okay, thank you, Brad. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint, which I will be referring to, given the brief time limit we've got here. A theory has been growing in acceptance amongst biblical scholars that those responsible for Deuteronomy had direct oral or written access to a copy of the document known variously as the Vassal Treaty of Esarhaddon, Esarhaddon's Succession Treaty, or Esarhaddon's Succession Oath Document, and drew on it to formulate the wording in chapter 13, verses 2 through 18 in the Hebrew, and 28, 15 through 45. When the theory was formulated, 9 examples of this document were known. A 10th was excavated in 2012 at Tel Tayanat, the ancient Assyrian provincial capital of Kunalia. Both further study of the status of the rulers in the Zagros region, named in 8 of the earlier exemplars, and new implications from the latest tablet make the time ripe to re-examine the validity of this theory of dependence. As will be argued, the theory needs to be abandoned. So do also proposals that the Ade had been used to produce a short loyalty oath administered to the citizens of Judah, which then was used in turn by a writer or redactor of Deuteronomy. In 673 BCE, King Esarhaddon failed to conquer Egypt on his first try. This led to a period of unrest and threatened coups the following year. Chronically ill and recently widowed, in 672, Esarhaddon proclaimed his plans for succession. His first son having died prematurely, he announced that upon his own death, his eldest living son, Shamash-shum-ukin, would ascend the throne of Babylonia, and that Ashurbanipal, his third son, born to the former queen Esarhaddon, would assume the throne of Assyria. This decision was controversial, as indicated in a letter written to the king by the royal exorcist, who claimed it was not a plan done in heaven, but done by the king on earth to place the eldest on the lesser throne. In the hopes of securing the smooth enactment of his stated preferences, he ordered the production of numerous copies of an Ade document stating his expectations and the consequences for failing to enforce them. Curses make up 34% of the total document. Officials and representatives throughout the Assyrian Empire participated in oath-swearing ceremonies at designated locales, where copies of 2 recensions of an original master text, one with a longer preamble, appear to have been displayed as reminders. The extant tablets bear the dates 12 through 18 of ER, that's in May of 672 BCE. 350 fragments of at least 8 smashed tablets were recovered from inside the throne room adjacent to the Temple of Nabu in ancient Kalhu, the military headquarters of the cavalry and chariotry. They are inside the very room where Ashurbanipal had been enthroned as Esarhaddon's successor. The names of only 6 of the 8 rulers have been preserved, but they were all from the Zagros mountain region, which already had become subjected to direct Assyrian political control before the reign of Esarhaddon, to create a loyal buffer zone against a long-standing enemy, Urartu. The Zagros region was a source of horses and brave warriors, but little else. It was hard to secure and police. While these 8 individuals remained hereditary rulers whose successors had to be confirmed by the king of Assyria, they were also formally subject to the closest Assyrian provincial governor. Thus, they were not strictly vassal kings, as had been assumed in previous discussions. They bore the lesser title of city lord, Bel Ali, not the title of king, Sharu, that had been used formerly in correspondence before their becoming part of Greater Assyria. Instead, they were officials of the larger Assyrian Empire, and as such, had sworn the oath to make Ashurbanipal king at Esarhaddon's death, along with other Assyrian provincial administrators. As noted by Morton Cogan, none of their native gods are invoked in the curse sections, which also seems to corroborate their status as provincial Assyrians, not vassal kings. The 8 tablets belonging to city lords of the Zagros Mountains have been cited as evidence that all 39 Assyrian vassals, including King Manasseh of Judah, were required to swear the loyalty oath in 672, but as argued, they do not support that understanding. Nor does the statement made in the name of Ashurbanipal on Prism A about his father's oath-swearing activities, where he includes Assyrian citizens only as the oath takers, that is, those residing in the 71 provinces of the empire, but not the additional 39 client vassal kings who ruled over land outside the imperial territory proper. Given the expansive language in the wording, bragging about the inclusion of all foreign kings under his control as well would have enhanced the message, which implies it had not been part of the official policy. In light of the number of extant queries, a very large number of extant queries made on behalf of Esarhaddon to the deity Shamash about the loyalty of a number of vassals alongside royal family members, palace staff, the military, royal administrators, and appointees, whose loyalties were suspect. It's possible that some vassals whose loyalties were suspect might have been included in the oath swearing proceedings. Judah does not appear among the 15 named groups. The Philistines do, however, and one can note that the Teltayanate copy of the oath documents contains 2 curses not found in any of the Nimrud exemplars. They invoke the god Adad and the goddess Shala of Kurba'il, and the goddess Sharat Ekron, queen of heaven. Ekron was one of the 4 Philistine cities at the time. This suggests the possibility that representatives of these 2 vassal cities participated in the oath ceremony conducted at Kunalia. It does not prove by extension, however, that all vassals swore the oath and received a copy of the document to display back home. To summarize, no proof exists that all Assyrian vassals were required to attend an oath-taking ceremony at one or more designated Assyrian locations in 672, where they would have received a copy of Esarhaddon's succession document. No evidence exists that a copy of this document ended up in Judah. No evidence exists that Judahite scribes accessed its contents in written or oral form in a neighboring Assyrian province like Samarina or at the chancellery of the court of Ekron. Without the opportunity of direct contact with or accessibility to the document being able to be established, further proposed parallels demonstrating dependency lose their force. Even so, when one looks at the proposed parallels, it becomes evident that they represent a very small proportion of both Esarhaddon's Ade document and the book of Deuteronomy. And when the details are examined, there are many questionable assertions and conclusions that have been made. Donald Wiseman was the first to observe that sections 39 through 42 of Esarhaddon's succession Ade follow the hierarchical order of the Assyrian pantheon. Biblical scholars then noted that the order of the punishments to be inflicted in the Assyrian text is almost paralleled in Deuteronomy 28, 25 through 33, 8 verses of a larger curse section covering 31 verses. They argued the biblical text follows the logic dictated by the order of the Assyrian pantheon, and so must have derived from Esarhaddon's succession Ade specifically. The almost involves the fact that in the Assyrian text, pestilence and unburied bodies is the third curse, while in Deuteronomy it is the first. So basically, the order is not the same and does not follow the hierarchy of the Assyrian pantheon, since it would place Ninurta at the head of the list of gods, not third after Sin and Shamash. In addition, other parts of the Assyrian curses are not present in Deuteronomy. May sin forbid you from entering into the presence of the god or king. Roam the desert like the wild ass and gazelle in section 39 is absent from 28:27. In section 40, the only punishment to be dispensed by Shamash is blindness, so that one will walk about in darkness. But in verses 28 through 29, the punishments are madness, blindness, and confusion of mind. And while groping in darkness is mentioned, so also is continual abuse and robbery, which appears nowhere in section 40. Both section 41 and verses 25 through 26 deal with the realities of death and non-burial in war, but not in identical terms. Finally, section 42 mentions wives lying in the lap of the enemy and sons who will not inherit the house because the enemy will divide your goods. Deuteronomy 28:30 through 33 deals in general with the same theme of what happens to individuals when enemies conquer, but the examples are not identical. It is becoming increasingly recognized that the 18 or so curses in Deuteronomy 28:15 through 45 reflect standard tropes used in the wider ancient Near Eastern treaty tradition, the Assyrian treaty tradition, from which the curses in Esarhaddon's succession Ade also drew, or possibly a West Semitic Aramaic or Northwest Semitic curse tradition. They draw on cross-culturally shared experiences of the realities of war, famine, drought, and pestilence, and their aftermaths. Thus, on literary grounds alone, the likelihood that the author of Deuteronomy composed 4 of the 18 or so curses in chapter 28 from his knowledge of the context of sections 38 through 42 of Esarhaddon's succession Ade are minuscule. The similarity in language and ideology concerning the handling of political sedition in sections 10 and 12 of Esarhaddon's succession Ade, and 2 of the 3 subsections concerning sedition in the form of religious apostasy in Deuteronomy 13, has led some scholars to posit a direct link between the 2. Immediately, it is apparent that the 3rd subsection of Deuteronomy, Hebrew verses 13 through 18, where the enticers are scoundrels who have subverted the other inhabitants of their town to commit apostasy by worshiping other gods, has no parallel in the wording of the Ade. Also, in order to make the alleged borrowing work, scholars have to enlist the aid of section 12, because there is no mention of killing anyone in section 10, as there is in all 3 sections of chapter 13. The gradations of rebellious behavior and their accompanying responses do not align between the political sedition in sections 10 and 12 and the religious sedition in Deuteronomy 13. In the Ade, the negative words that could be spoken by a long list of people in section 10 are less of an immediate threat and can be left to the king to investigate as he sees fit after he receives reports. Death is not a necessary outcome. Only those plotting assassination in section 12 must be killed. In all 3 cases in Deuteronomy, there are those who have committed apostasy and so are to be killed, whether or not they have managed to persuade others to join them. Also in the Ade, the family members precede the religious personnel, where in Deuteronomy 13, the apostate prophets and dream dividers precede the family members, who also include mother's relatives, not just the father's side of the family, and close friends who are absent in the Ade. On the other hand, the enemies and allies of the Ade are missing in Deuteronomy. What seems to be close connections to some, at first glance, are less so upon more careful examination. During the debates that have taken place over these proposed parallels, new evidence from extant ancient Near Eastern treaties has been added into the mix, which provides even closer parallels than the combination of sections 10 and 12. In particular, the Hittite Ismarika Treaty provides close parallels to both the first and second subsections in Deuteronomy 13, but has none for the case of seditious prophets and diviners in the first section, while the Aramaic Safiri Treaty provides a parallel to the second subsection. Together, these two treaties demonstrate that sedition was common among royal family members and court officials, and that the defection of an entire city that housed the leader of insurrection was perceived as a real threat in many kingdoms and empires. Both became standard issues to be included in treaty stipulations as deemed necessary. The idea that Esarhaddon's Succession Ade was used as a direct or secondary source for composing any part of Deuteronomy should be abandoned. The lack of proof that all vassals were required to participate alongside Assyrian officials and representatives in the oath-swearing ceremonies that appear to have taken place in various locales around the Assyrian Empire in May of 672 removes the needed proof that the writer of chapters 13 and 28 of Deuteronomy would have been able to access the document in written or oral form. No copy was known to have ended up in Judah, be that at Manasseh's court or at the residence of the Assyrian Kepu at Ramat Rachel. In addition, the proposed parallels are not unique to the Esarhaddon Succession Ade, but rather reflect standard tropes and curses and real threats of sedition from the royal family and court, and the wider population that are present in extant ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties. Rather than look for an outside source from which these ideas would have derived, it is logical to propose instead that the ideas expressed in chapters 13 and 28 were familiar from the native monarchic Judahite treaty template, which would have shared much in common with other regional templates because treaties were an international genre, yet which still would have had its own particular references and format. Thank you. That is all.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and bring us all back in here. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Tammy, to engage for a little bit with Diana.
Great. Thank you, Diana. As always, you have an ability to actually look at the details and say, no, you can't say that, which resonates so beautifully with me. And having worked at Ekron with you once upon a time.
Isn't this a great reference?
Right, I love that. I love that. So yes, the pestilence god of Ekron, I am well familiar with. Thank you. So at the beginning, you mentioned the possible indirect use of the Esarhaddon oath, Ade by biblical writers. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea, please?
Well, yes, that's great because with time limitations, I had to sort of cut out a little bit. But anyway, yes.
Pestilence God was helping us.
That's right. That's right. Now let me see. Wait just a sec here. There we go. Oh, am I sharing a screen?
Not yet. Okay.
So let's see. How do I end of slideshow? Click to exit. Okay. Okay, so let me bring up a paragraph that I had to leave out, but was kind of hoping I might, Yeah, so there have been a number of people, but Eckhart Otto has been the champion, really, of the idea. A suggestion has been made that the account of this treaty that was entered into, or relationship that was entered into in 2 Kings 23, 1-3, the covenant that was made between the king and people under Josiah, actually was drawn up on the basis of Esarhaddon's Ade, but in a very shortened form, and that sections 13 and 28 were part of this covenant document that had initially been created, and then that Judean version would have been the source that was used by the authors of Deuteronomy. So they've added in sort of an intermediate step. And I think this is done in part by the recognition that you've got these whole documents and yet you have only a very few set of verses that are being cited as having direct dependence. And as I point out here in this paragraph, that idea was actually, the groundwork was laid for it by Rintje Frankena and Moshe Weinfeld, who had made this argument that Deuteronomy 13 had been part of that covenant thing. And they thought it became part of or Deuteronomium. But Weinfeld did not say, Weinfeld pointed out that this was a standard element in Hittite, Aramaean, and Neo-Assyrian treaties. So he does not look for a single source, whereas Otto has pinpointed the single source as Esarhaddon's Ade treaty.
So, can I ask a slightly larger question then?
Sure.
Because, and this is something I think about because both I am teaching a course on sort of the, original thinkers of religion, right? So I'm looking at these guys who ideas sort of were going one way, right? Once upon a time, 100, 200 years ago. And then where we are now. And so how do we use these old ideas and ground them without having to constantly eject them completely or not? And in particular, I am now old enough to see how an idea, when it was initially put forward, made sense with the data that we had available to us, right? Mm-hmm. And so so this is on some levels, a larger question of how do we use ancient Near Eastern documents with understanding the biblical text alongside our changing notions of what the biblical text is, and how do we get it into the literature, the new approaches, once these other approaches are so firmly embedded?
Yeah, well, the latter is really the biggest problem, because yes, it is the case.
At the time, right, Weinfeld wasn't radically wrong, right, with the data.
No, he wasn't. He was, I mean, not everyone would necessarily say that Deuteronomy 13 was part of this early document kind of a thing, but he at least was cautious enough to point out he wasn't trying to do a one-on-one dependence. So I think part of our issue as biblical scholars is, and you're heading the section to deal with this, we want to situate these texts in an ancient Near Eastern context, because the biblical writers were not sui generis, they were part of a much larger exchange. So we need to understand the patterns, the literary patterns that were used, templates and things. And we need to be able to do that to see which ones of these were shared pretty widely, or what might be much more specifically unique to the biblical writers. So, in wanting to do that, there's nothing wrong with looking at the kinds of documents that we have, and we don't have that many. So I think when we find a parallel somewhere, people want to, bring it up, say, oh, look at this parallel. We've got parallels to the late Bronze Age treaty traditions. No one has stopped to ask the question, how do you bridge the gap between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age in the book of Deuteronomy? But there actually is an explanation for that, which is what I suggested at the end of my paper. That is the late Bronze Age treaty tradition, which we only have examples of from the Hittites, actually, their copies. That was an international treaty tradition. That tradition would have been used with vassals and things in Palestine, in ancient Canaan, and that would have become the standard template that was passed on and used in the Iron Age. We see the same thing amongst Aramaic treaty tradition. The Aramaic template has some of this late Bronze Age, very Hittite-looking stuff that has been combined with what you have in the Mesopotamian tradition that has developed in a few other ways, because the Aramaeans were influenced by both areas. So I think that the explanation for why you get these parallels going back to the late Bronze Age Hittite things that look closer in many ways than the Mesopotamian has to do with the fact that that was the local tradition that came to be accepted, that was passed on. It might have become modified over time by treaties that were, vassal treaties by the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians, but we don't have any of those documents. So, we have that problem, because ironically, there would have been a vassal treaty that, that Manasseh would have had. We don't have a copy of that, but we can say for sure that, the chancellery in Jerusalem should have had a copy of that. But since we don't have that document, people can't look to that to say, oh, look at these parallels here. There is some influence here. They can't do that. So they're looking at what they have, but what they have, we can't prove would have actually been available to the chancellery in Judah. So that's sort of the problem we have. So it's not the problem is to contextualize and look at what we can use, but also not just push those documents beyond their, what they are and the context in which they are, to serve a purpose that, pushes them too far. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Do I have time for one more question?
Yeah, we can do one more, I think.
Okay. So, so on the list, right, of folks mentioned, I think it's in the Taltainite one, right, we have our friends, the Philistines, and some others, and of course, Judah is not there, right? Do you want to comment?
And it's not anywhere in those texts that were of hundreds of questions put to Shamash, the sun god, oracles about people who are rebelling. Esarhaddon was extremely suspicious, shall we say, and paranoid. And he had very bad health, and there were all sorts of complications at court. And when you put the younger son ahead of the other one, he's created all sorts of problems for himself. So he suspects also everyone, but 15 different groups, and it says Philistines, it doesn't say Ekron, but there's nothing about Judahites or nothing about, Southern Levantines. There's no Ammonites, there's no Moabites, none of that. So that suggests that there wouldn't have been any suspicion of the Judahites. And if Kurba'il and Ekron, their gods are cited, in that curse section. So if those two vassals have to appear, we're not sure where Kurba'il is, maybe someone in Syria, it's a fairly long way to have to go from Ekron up there. It doesn't seem like they were including that many vassals. It was only ones they were really, really suspicious of. Great. Judah doesn't fall under those circumstances, it seems to me.
Well, just hearing this makes me miss in-person meetings and luncheons and sessions, and this just been wonderful. And so thank you, Diana, and thank you, Tammy, for the paper and for the session. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and catching this installment. Hope you'll catch a future one as well. And indeed, maybe someday soon, we will hold our regional meeting back face to face again. Until then, take good care of